Step away from my door, or you are going to regret bringing this situation here." Those were not words I expected to hear myself think as I looked through my front window and saw the flashing lights outside my house. It was after 10 p.m. on a quiet Tuesday night, and two police vehicles were parked along my driveway, while Karen Whitmore, the president of our homeowners association, stood on my front lawn with the confidence of someone who believed she had already won. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and until that night, I thought owning my own home meant having a place where my family could feel safe, peaceful, and independent. I never imagined that a disagreement over my own property would turn into a situation where my neighbors were watching from their windows, waiting to see what would happen next. The strange part was that this entire situation started with something incredibly small. A few weeks earlier, Karen had sent me a notice claiming my front yard needed immediate visual improvement because she did not like the way I arranged a few outdoor decorations near my garden. I had owned my home for several years, maintained my property carefully, and always followed the community rules. I was not someone looking for conflict. I simply wanted to understand what rule I had broken. When I asked Karen to show me the specific regulation, she avoided answering directly. Instead, she repeated that the HOA had standards and that residents needed to respect the decisions of the board. That was the first moment I realized this was not really about a decoration. It was about control. I responded politely and requested everything in writing. I thought that would calm things down. Instead, it seemed to make Karen more determined. Over the next several days, I received additional messages about different parts of my property. One email mentioned my driveway. Another questioned a small improvement project in my backyard. None of the complaints came with clear violations or actual evidence. They were simply demands. I saved every message, every notice, and every conversation because something about the situation felt unusual. I did not know it at the time, but those records would become extremely important later. Karen, however, seemed convinced that I would eventually give up. She had built her reputation in the neighborhood around being the person who always got the final word. She arrived at meetings wearing expensive designer outfits, large accessories, and a confident expression that made it clear she enjoyed the authority of her position. Many neighbors avoided challenging her because they did not want the stress. But I had spent years working hard for my home, and I was not willing to surrender my rights simply because someone had an HOA title. That night, when Karen arrived with the police, I knew she wanted the moment to intimidate me. She expected me to open the door, apologize, and accept whatever accusation she made. But she did not know something important. I was not standing there unprepared. I had documents. I had records. I had proof of every conversation. And more importantly, I had a family that believed problems should be handled calmly and correctly. As I watched Karen step closer to my front door, I heard her confidently explain her version of events. She sounded certain that everyone would automatically believe her. Then I heard my wife Olivia's footsteps coming down the hallway behind me. She had been away earlier that evening and had just returned home. She looked at me, noticed the situation outside, and quietly asked what was happening. I told her everything in a few words. Then she walked toward the door. I still remember Karen's expression when she saw Olivia standing beside me. It was the first time that night her confidence seemed to disappear for a moment. She had expected a homeowner who would simply obey. She did not expect a family that was ready to stand calmly on the facts. And as I opened the door, I realized this was no longer just about a yard decoration or an HOA complaint. This was about discovering how far someone would go when they believed rules only applied to everyone else. The next morning, I woke up expecting the situation from the night before to feel like a bad memory. But the messages waiting on my phone reminded me that Karen Whitmore was not finished. The police had left after confirming that the disagreement was a civil matter, and my family was able to return to a quiet evening. But Karen had clearly hoped that her arrival at my door would create fear and pressure. Instead, it revealed something important. She was willing to use the appearance of authority when she did not actually have the power she claimed. I sat at my kitchen table with Olivia beside me, reviewing every document, every email, and every notice that Karen had sent over the previous weeks. Olivia listened carefully as I explained how the situation had started. She did not react with anger. She simply asked one question: what exactly does the HOA believe gives them control over your property? That question stayed with me because I had been asking myself the same thing. I spent that morning going through the community guidelines and comparing them with every complaint Karen had made. The more I reviewed the information, the clearer the pattern became. The HOA had rules, but those rules had limits. Karen was acting as if her personal opinion carried the same weight as an official regulation. She had confused having a position with having unlimited authority. Later that afternoon, I received another message from her. The tone was completely different from the night before. Instead of sounding confident in front of the officers, she now wrote that the HOA expected my full cooperation and that refusing to comply could lead to additional consequences. I read the message twice because I wanted to make sure I understood it correctly. She still had not explained which specific rule I had broken. She still had not provided any documentation. She simply expected me to accept her decision because she was the HOA president. That was the moment I realized I needed to stop treating this like a simple disagreement between neighbors. I needed to treat it like a situation where every detail mattered. I created a folder on my computer and organized everything by date. The first complaint, my responses, Karen's replies, the notices, the requests, even the time she arrived at my house with the police. I was not trying to create a fight. I was creating a record. Across the street, I noticed some neighbors who had watched the events unfold the previous night were starting to act differently. A few of them stopped by to ask if everything was okay. They were careful with their words, but I could tell they had questions. One neighbor mentioned that Karen had contacted them before about minor issues too. Another said they had never felt comfortable challenging her decisions because they did not want to become her next target. Hearing those stories changed how I viewed the situation. This was not just about my front yard anymore. It was about whether one person could make an entire community feel powerless. That evening, Olivia and I sat outside and talked about what needed to happen next. She reminded me that the strongest response was not anger. It was preparation. If Karen wanted to use rules and procedures, then I would do the same. I would follow every proper step, keep every record, and make sure the truth was impossible to ignore. The following day, Karen scheduled another HOA discussion and invited several board members. She probably believed the meeting would be another opportunity to pressure me into giving in. She did not know that I was walking into that room with something she did not expect. I was not coming with frustration or accusations. I was coming with facts. And for the first time since this started, I felt that the balance had shifted. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, and I arrived earlier than expected because I wanted time to review my notes one more time. I walked into the community room carrying a small folder with everything I had collected since the first complaint. It was not a thick folder because I was not trying to overwhelm anyone. It only contained the facts, dates, messages, notices, and the exact words that had been exchanged between Karen Whitmore and me. Olivia came with me, and her calm attitude helped remind me that this was not about winning an argument. It was about making sure the truth was clear. When Karen entered the room, she looked completely different from the woman who had stood outside my house with the police. She was dressed in another expensive outfit, with carefully chosen accessories and the same confident expression she always wore during HOA meetings. She greeted the board members like everything was normal. For a moment, I wondered if she truly believed the previous night had gone exactly the way she wanted. The meeting began with Karen explaining her version of events. She described herself as someone who was simply trying to protect the community. She mentioned neighborhood standards, property appearance, and the responsibility of the HOA board. But as she continued speaking, I noticed something important. She kept using general statements, but she never addressed the specific question I had asked from the beginning. Which exact rule had I violated? When it was my turn to speak, I placed my folder on the table and calmly explained the timeline. I started with the first notice Karen sent me. I explained that I had asked for clarification and that I had never refused to cooperate. I showed the board members the messages where I requested the specific regulation connected to the complaint. Then I showed their responses. The room became quieter as everyone reviewed the information. Karen interrupted several times, saying that the HOA president had the responsibility to make judgment calls when necessary. But that was exactly the problem. A judgment call could not replace an actual rule. A personal preference could not become a violation simply because someone had authority within the HOA. One board member asked Karen if there was a written regulation that specifically supported her complaint. For the first time, I saw hesitation on her face. She looked through her own documents, but could not provide the answer she had confidently claimed existed. Olivia quietly pointed out that following proper procedures protected everyone involved, including the HOA. She explained that clear communication and consistent enforcement were important because communities only worked when residents trusted the system. That statement changed the tone of the meeting. This was no longer about whether Karen liked the way my property looked. It was about whether the HOA was applying rules fairly. After the meeting ended, several neighbors approached me. They did not celebrate or create a scene. Instead, they simply shared their own experiences. Some had received unclear warnings. Some had been confused by changing expectations. Others admitted they avoided speaking up because they believed nothing would change. Listening to them made me realize how long this issue had been building beneath the surface. Karen had always relied on people staying quiet. She believed confidence was enough to convince everyone she was right. But confidence could not replace evidence. Over the next few days, I continued organizing everything I had collected. I knew the situation was not over. Karen still had influence, and she was unlikely to accept that her approach had been questioned. But something had changed. The people around her were no longer simply accepting every decision without asking questions. The first crack in her carefully built image had appeared, and it came from something she never expected. Not confrontation, not anger, just facts that could not be ignored. The following week felt different. The neighborhood that once seemed quiet and disconnected was now filled with conversations about what had happened during the HOA meeting. I noticed more people paying attention, asking questions, and looking carefully at decisions that had previously been accepted without discussion. But I also knew Karen Whitmore was not someone who would simply step aside after being challenged. She had spent years building her reputation around being the person who had the final say, and losing control of the situation was something she clearly did not handle well. A few days after the meeting, I received another message from her. This time, the tone was more formal. She requested another conversation about my property and claimed that the HOA needed to clarify expectations moving forward. I read the message carefully before responding. The old version of me might have immediately replied with frustration, but I had learned something important. Emotions could create more problems, but patience and documentation created solutions. I responded politely and asked that any concerns be provided with the specific community rules and written explanations. I wanted everything to remain clear and professional. That evening, Olivia and I discussed what might happen next. She reminded me that people who rely on pressure often become uncomfortable when everything is handled through proper channels. She was right. Karen had always been successful because many residents avoided conflict. She depended on quick conversations, assumptions, and people feeling too tired to challenge her decisions. But when every statement had to be supported with facts, the situation changed. The following morning, I received a call from one of the HOA board members. He explained that the board had reviewed some of the concerns raised during the meeting and wanted to make sure future communications followed the correct process. It was not a dramatic victory, but it was a sign that something was shifting. For the first time, the conversation was not controlled by Karen alone. Later that afternoon, I saw Karen outside the community center speaking with a few residents. She was trying to explain that she had only acted in the best interest of everyone. But the difference was that people were now asking questions. They wanted details. They wanted consistency. They wanted to understand how decisions were being made. That was something Karen had not expected. She had prepared for resistance from me, but she had not prepared for an entire community becoming more aware. As the days passed, I continued reviewing every piece of information related to the situation. I found small details that seemed unimportant at first, but became meaningful when placed together. One message where Karen changed her explanation. One notice that referenced a rule differently than before. One conversation where she suggested consequences without explaining the process behind them. None of these things alone seemed like a major issue, but together they created a clear picture. The problem was not one disagreement. The problem was a pattern of decisions being made without enough transparency. Then came the moment that changed everything. Olivia returned home earlier than expected one evening, still wearing her official uniform from work. As we talked about the latest developments, we noticed a vehicle stopping near our driveway. Karen was inside. She had come to speak with us directly. When she approached the house, she expected the same dynamic as before. She expected to see a homeowner who felt pressured. Instead, she saw Olivia standing beside me, calm and prepared, with the confidence of someone who understood how important it was to follow proper procedures. Karen paused for a moment. It was subtle, but I noticed it. For the first time, she seemed unsure of how to control the conversation. She had built her entire strategy around authority and intimidation. But now she was facing something different. A family that was not afraid, not aggressive, and not willing to ignore the facts. The conversation that followed would reveal even more about what Karen had been trying to accomplish, and it would become the moment when her carefully maintained image started to change in front of everyone. When Karen Whitmore arrived at my house that evening, I could immediately tell she expected the conversation to go exactly the way she wanted. She stood near the front walkway with the same confident expression she always carried during HOA meetings, as if every situation could be solved simply by reminding people that she was the president of the association. But this time was different. I was not standing there confused or unprepared. Olivia was beside me, calm and professional, and we were ready to have a conversation based on facts instead of assumptions. Karen started by explaining that she believed there had been a misunderstanding. She said the HOA was only trying to maintain community standards and that some residents needed reminders about their responsibilities. It sounded reasonable at first, but I had heard the same explanation before. The difference was that now I understood the importance of asking specific questions. I politely asked her which exact rule she believed I had violated and requested that she explain how the HOA had reached that conclusion. For a moment, she paused. Then she changed direction and said the issue was not just one rule, but the overall appearance of my property. That answer confirmed what I had suspected. The problem was never a clear violation. It was based on personal opinion. Olivia calmly asked Karen if the HOA had a consistent process for these types of concerns. She did not accuse her or raise her voice. She simply wanted to understand the procedure. Karen seemed uncomfortable with the question because it moved the conversation away from authority and toward accountability. She tried to explain that the HOA board had the ability to make decisions when necessary. But again, she could not provide a specific guideline that supported her actions. After Karen left, Olivia and I sat down and reviewed everything that had happened. We knew this situation was becoming bigger than a disagreement about a property issue. Karen had created a pattern where her personal interpretation seemed to matter more than written rules. The more we organized the information, the more obvious that pattern became. Over the next several days, something unexpected happened. More neighbors began reaching out. They were not looking for drama. They simply wanted to share their own experiences. One neighbor told me that Karen had previously questioned small changes around their home without clearly explaining the reason. Another mentioned receiving warnings that felt confusing because the rules seemed to change depending on the situation. I listened carefully because I knew every person had their own experience, but the similarities were difficult to ignore. Meanwhile, Karen continued trying to protect her image. She sent messages reminding residents about the importance of respecting the HOA board. But the response from the community had changed. People were no longer accepting statements without asking questions. They wanted transparency. They wanted consistency. They wanted to know that everyone was being treated fairly. I realized Karen's biggest mistake was assuming that people would always stay silent. She believed confidence and position were enough to maintain control. But once people started looking at the details, the situation became much harder to manage. Olivia reminded me that the goal was never to embarrass Karen or create conflict. The goal was simple: protect our home, follow the correct process, and make sure everyone was treated fairly. As I looked through the growing collection of documents and messages, I knew the next step would be important. Karen had started this situation believing she could force a quick decision. Instead, every action she took was creating more questions, and those questions were beginning to change the entire neighborhood. The days following the changes in the neighborhood were unlike anything I had experienced before. For years, many residents had quietly accepted Karen Whitmore's decisions because they believed challenging the HOA president would only create more problems. But after the meeting and the conversations that followed, people started looking at the situation differently. They were not looking for conflict. They were simply realizing that asking questions was not the same as causing trouble. One Saturday morning, I received a message from a neighbor named Daniel. He asked if he could stop by and talk about something that had been bothering him for a long time. When he arrived, he explained that he had received several notices from Karen over the years, but never understood exactly what rules he had violated. He always assumed the HOA must have been correct because Karen spoke with so much confidence. Hearing that made me think about how powerful confidence could be when nobody asked for proof. Daniel was not the only person who reached out. Over the next week, more neighbors shared similar experiences. Some described receiving unclear warnings. Others mentioned situations where they felt they had no chance to explain their side. A few admitted that they avoided attending HOA meetings because they believed decisions had already been made before discussions even started. I listened carefully because I did not want to exaggerate anything. Every person had a different story, and I knew facts mattered more than emotions. But when those stories were placed together, a pattern became impossible to ignore. Karen had created an environment where many residents felt they had to accept decisions instead of participate in them. Olivia and I continued organizing the information we had collected. We created a simple timeline showing when each complaint happened, what Karen claimed, what questions we asked, and what responses we received. The goal was not to attack Karen. The goal was to understand whether the HOA process was being followed correctly. Olivia often reminded me that the strongest position came from staying calm and accurate. She had seen situations become worse when people reacted emotionally, and she knew that patience was often more effective than confrontation. Meanwhile, Karen appeared to be trying to regain control. She sent another community message reminding everyone that the HOA board was responsible for maintaining standards. The message sounded professional, but many residents noticed something missing. There was still no explanation of the specific issues that started everything. There were still no clear answers. People began asking questions directly during online discussions and community conversations. They wanted to know how decisions were made and whether the same standards applied to everyone. For the first time, Karen was facing something she had not expected. It was not one homeowner disagreeing with her. It was an entire community becoming more involved. A few days later, the HOA board announced another meeting to discuss concerns raised by residents. When I saw the announcement, I knew this was going to be an important moment. The situation had moved far beyond my original complaint about my property. It had become a conversation about trust and responsibility. I prepared my documents again, reviewed every detail, and made sure everything I planned to say was supported by information. Olivia stood beside me as we prepared to leave for the meeting. She looked at the folder in my hand and reminded me of something simple. The truth did not need to be loud. It only needed to be clear. As we drove toward the community center, I realized Karen's biggest challenge was no longer convincing me to follow her demands. Her challenge was answering the questions that more and more people were finally willing to ask. When I walked into the community center for the next HOA meeting, I could feel that the atmosphere had changed. It was no longer a room where everyone quietly listened while Karen Whitmore explained what she believed was best. Residents arrived earlier than usual, carrying notes, asking questions, and speaking with each other before the meeting officially started. The difference was clear. People were paying attention. They were no longer just accepting information. They wanted understanding. I sat beside Olivia with the folder of documents between us. I had reviewed everything carefully before arriving because I knew this meeting was not about emotions. It was about accuracy. Every statement needed to be supported by facts, and every question deserved a clear answer. When Karen entered the room, she appeared confident, but I noticed something different. She looked around and realized this was not the same audience she was used to addressing. The residents were not silent. They were prepared. The meeting began with Karen discussing the importance of maintaining community standards. She explained that the HOA existed to protect property values and create a consistent neighborhood environment. Nobody disagreed with those goals. The problem was how those rules were being applied. One resident raised a question about communication procedures. Another asked how homeowners could appeal decisions they believed were incorrect. Karen attempted to answer, but the conversation continued moving toward one central issue: transparency. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and calmly explained the timeline of events. I did not accuse Karen of anything. I simply presented what happened. I showed the original notices, my requests for clarification, and the responses I received. I explained that I had always been willing to cooperate, but cooperation required knowing exactly what was expected. Several board members reviewed the documents while the room remained quiet. Then one board member asked Karen a direct question about the specific rule connected to my original complaint. Karen repeated that the HOA had the responsibility to maintain standards, but the question remained unanswered. The board member asked again for the exact regulation. This time, Karen looked through her notes before responding. That moment was important because everyone could see the difference between having authority and having evidence. Olivia then explained that clear procedures protected both homeowners and the HOA. She pointed out that consistent enforcement was necessary because rules only worked when people understood them and trusted how they were applied. Her words changed the conversation. Instead of focusing on one homeowner and one complaint, everyone started discussing the larger process. Several residents shared examples of situations where they felt confused by unclear expectations. They were respectful, but they wanted answers. Karen tried to explain that every situation was different, but the residents continued asking the same reasonable question. If the rules existed, why were they not being explained clearly? As the meeting continued, the board decided that future HOA communications needed to include more specific information. They also agreed that residents should have a clearer way to request explanations and challenge decisions they believed were inconsistent. It was not a dramatic moment, but it was a meaningful one. The system was starting to change because people were participating. After the meeting ended, I walked outside with Olivia and looked back at the community center. A few months earlier, I never expected a simple disagreement about my home to lead to a discussion involving the entire neighborhood. But I also realized something important. The issue was never about defeating Karen. It was about making sure everyone understood that rules should work the same way for everyone. As we walked toward our car, I received a message from one of the board members asking if I could provide additional documentation for the official review process. I looked at Olivia and smiled because I knew what that meant. The situation had moved beyond arguments and opinions. It had entered a stage where facts would determine what happened next. And for the first time since this began, Karen was no longer controlling the direction of the conversation. The days after the HOA meeting were quieter, but I knew the situation was not finished. In many ways, the most important part was just beginning. The board had requested additional documentation, and I wanted to make sure every detail was accurate before submitting anything. I spent the next several evenings reviewing my records, organizing everything by date, and checking that every statement could be connected to a specific message or document. Olivia helped me go through the information one more time. She reminded me that the strongest arguments were not built on frustration. They were built on clear facts and a logical timeline. A few days later, I submitted the complete record to the HOA board. It included the original complaints, my responses, the requests for clarification, and the conversations that followed. I also included notes explaining where I believed the communication process had failed. I did not write personal opinions about Karen Whitmore. I focused only on what happened. That decision turned out to be important because it kept the conversation centered on the process instead of personalities. While the board reviewed the information, the neighborhood continued discussing the situation. More residents began attending HOA meetings, and more people started asking questions about how decisions were made. The change was not about turning against Karen. It was about residents becoming more involved in their own community. For the first time, many people were realizing that an HOA worked best when everyone understood the rules and participated in the process. Karen, however, seemed determined to defend her actions. She sent another message to residents explaining that the HOA had always acted responsibly and that misunderstandings could happen when people did not understand the purpose of community rules. The message sounded professional, but many residents noticed that it still avoided the main issue. People were not asking whether the HOA should have rules. They were asking whether those rules were being explained and applied fairly. The board eventually scheduled a review meeting to discuss the concerns that had been raised. When I arrived, I noticed the room felt different from the earlier meetings. Residents were prepared. They had questions written down. They wanted clarity. Olivia sat beside me as we waited for the discussion to begin. She quietly reminded me to stay focused on the facts, and that was exactly what I planned to do. During the meeting, the board members reviewed the timeline and asked Karen several questions about the original complaint. They asked why the specific regulation had not been provided when I requested it. They asked how similar situations had been handled with other residents. They asked whether the communication process could have been clearer. Karen attempted to explain that every decision was made with good intentions, but intentions were not the only thing that mattered. A fair system also required consistency and transparency. As the discussion continued, several residents shared their thoughts. They explained that they wanted a better process, not conflict. They wanted to know that if they ever had a question about an HOA decision, they would receive a clear explanation instead of feeling pressured to simply accept it. The board listened carefully and began discussing changes that could improve communication between the HOA and homeowners. After several hours, the meeting ended with a decision to review certain procedures and create clearer guidelines for future notices. It was not about one person losing and another person winning. It was about making the system better for everyone. Walking out of the community center, I thought back to the night Karen arrived at my door with the police. She believed that moment would force me to surrender. Instead, it became the moment that started a much bigger conversation. The biggest change was not that Karen's influence disappeared overnight. The biggest change was that people stopped assuming authority was the same thing as being right. And that was something no title, position, or confident speech could take away. Looking back at everything that happened, I still think about how differently that night could have ended if I had reacted the way Karen Whitmore expected. When she arrived at my home believing that pressure and authority would solve everything, she did not realize that the situation would eventually become a lesson about patience, preparation, and understanding your rights. My goal was never to challenge the HOA just for the sake of conflict. I wanted the same thing every homeowner wants: fairness, clear communication, and the confidence that rules are being applied equally. After the review process was completed, the HOA began making changes to how concerns were handled. Future notices required clearer explanations, residents had better opportunities to ask questions, and the board became more focused on making decisions based on written guidelines instead of personal opinions. These changes did not happen because one person defeated another. They happened because people finally became willing to participate and ask for transparency. Karen remained part of the community, but the way people viewed her role had changed. The confidence she once used to end conversations no longer had the same effect because residents had learned something important. Respect for a position comes from responsibility, not simply from having a title. For my family, life slowly returned to normal. I spent more time enjoying my home instead of worrying about the next message from the HOA. Olivia and I often talked about how a difficult situation had unexpectedly brought people together. What started as a disagreement over my property turned into a conversation about how a community should function. The most valuable lesson I learned was that staying calm can be more powerful than reacting emotionally. When someone tries to create pressure, the best response is often preparation. Keep records. Understand the rules. Ask questions. Let facts guide the conversation. Months later, I would still occasionally see Karen around the neighborhood. The difference was that the relationship between residents and the HOA had changed. People were more involved. Meetings were more open. Questions were welcomed instead of ignored. The community became stronger because everyone understood that a healthy neighborhood depends on cooperation, not control. When I think back to the moment I looked through my window and saw those vehicles outside my house, I remember how uncertain everything felt. At that moment, I had no idea that a single evening would lead to a larger discussion that changed the way our neighborhood approached decisions. Karen believed that moment would make me step back. Instead, it reminded everyone that homeowners have a voice. It reminded the community that rules should protect people, not silence them. And it reminded me that standing up for what is right does not require anger or hostility. It requires confidence, honesty, and the willingness to follow the proper path. Now I want to ask you something. After hearing this story, what would you have done if you were in my position? Would you have stayed quiet to avoid conflict? Or would you have gathered the facts and asked the questions that needed to be answered? Share your thoughts because every perspective can create a better conversation. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real-life inspired HOA stories about homeowners standing up for fairness, consider subscribing to the channel. More stories are coming, and each one shows how knowledge, patience, and preparation can make a difference when ordinary people face extraordinary challenges.